The forest was quiet in the summer of 1939. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that comes just before something irreversible happens. On the outskirts of Warsaw, in a place known as Pyry Forest, a small group of men gathered far from cameras, far from flags, far from history books. There were no soldiers standing guard, no speeches, no sense that the world would ever remember this moment. On a wooden table lay several unremarkable objects, folders, handwritten notes, and the components of a machine most of Europe believed was unbreakable. Enigma machine. The men who placed them there were not generals. They did not command armies. They were mathematicians from a country that, within weeks, would be invaded, partitioned, and nearly erased from the map. They knew what was coming. They knew that once the war began, Poland would not have the luxury of time or survival. And so, in this forest, they made a decision that went against every instinct of secrecy and national self-preservation. They chose to give away the most valuable secret of the coming war. What happened in Pyry did not stop the invasion of Poland. It did not save their country, but it quietly reshaped the fate of World War II. And for decades, almost no one was told who made that possible. This is the story history learned too late, of the men who cracked Hitler's code and then disappeared from the narrative of victory. In the late 1930s, Europe lived under an illusion of order. Borders still existed on maps. Diplomacy still spoke the language of treaties and conferences. But beneath that surface, the continent was already at war with time. Germany was rearming at a speed unseen since the previous conflict. Its military doctrine relied not only on tanks and aircraft, but on something far less visible: absolute control of information. Orders crossed Europe in streams of encrypted radio traffic, moving faster than any army. And at the heart of that system was Enigma cipher machine, so complex that most governments believed it placed German communications beyond human reach. That belief shaped everything. British and French intelligence agencies treated Enigma as a long-term problem, not an urgent one. Breaking it was considered theoretically interesting but practically impossible before the outbreak of war. Resources were allocated elsewhere. Assumptions hardened. Confidence settled in. Poland did not have that luxury. Geography made certainty unavoidable. If war came, Poland would be first. Not eventually. Not symbolically. Immediately, the country understood that it would be invaded from multiple directions, with little chance of sustained resistance. This reality forced a different kind of thinking, one rooted in necessity rather than prestige. Polish intelligence approached the Enigma problem not as a puzzle to admire, but as a threat to survive. Instead of relying on traditional linguists and cryptographers, they turned to mathematicians, young men trained to see patterns where others saw chaos. This choice alone placed them outside the accepted doctrine of the time. Cipher work was not supposed to be abstract. It was supposed to be linguistic, procedural, incremental. What Poland attempted was radical, and it worked by the late 1930s. Polish cryptonists were not guessing at German messages. They were reading them, not perfectly, not effortlessly, but consistently enough to understand the structure of the system and its fatal assumptions. Here is where the story becomes dangerous. Poland knew that once the war began, their work would not survive. Laboratories would be destroyed. Archives seized. The mathematicians themselves would be scattered, captured, or killed. If the knowledge stayed in Warsaw, it would die there. Sharing it, however, carried its own risks. Giving away Enigma meant surrendering a strategic advantage. It meant trusting allies who had previously dismissed Polish warnings and underestimated their capabilities. It meant acknowledging a brutal truth: Poland would likely not be around to benefit from the victory this knowledge could bring. The decision was not made in optimism. It was made in clarity. That is why the meeting in the forest mattered. It was not a technical briefing. It was a transfer of responsibility of time itself. The Polish cryptanalysts were handing the future of this intelligence war to others, knowing they might never see the outcome. If they were right, the war could be shortened, supply lines exposed, battles anticipated. If they were wrong, or were ignored, millions would die under the assumption that German communications were untouchable. The forest meeting did not change history because of what was said there. It changed history because someone chose to listen. Years before anyone gathered in that forest, the story had already begun quietly, far from war rooms and headlines. In lecture halls and notebooks filled with symbols instead of words. In the early 1930s, Poland was rebuilding itself as a nation. Independence was young, fragile, and constantly threatened. The country lacked the industrial power of Germany or the global reach of Britain, but it possessed something less visible. A generation trained to think differently. Among them was Marian Rejewski, not a spy, not a soldier, but a mathematician with a talent for abstract structures. He had no interest in heroism. What drew him into intelligence work was a problem that refused to behave like language: German cipher traffic, intercepted by Polish intelligence, did not yield to traditional code breaking. Linguists found no foothold. Frequency analysis collapsed under the weight of mechanical complexity. Enigma did not scramble messages the way older ciphers did transform them. Rejewski understood that transformation was a mathematical act. Instead of asking what the messages said, he asked how the machine behaved. He treated Enigma not as a secret to guess, but as a system to model. With limited material, partial key lists, procedural hints, and relentless experimentation, he reconstructed the wiring logic of the machine itself. It was an intellectual leap few believed possible. Soon, he was joined by Jerzy Aryicki and Henryk Zagalski. Together, they formed a small unit that worked in isolation, under pressure, without public recognition. They were not celebrated. In fact, most of their own allies doubted them to keep pace with German changes. They built devices, surly, improvised machines designed not to encrypt, but to break. They created tools that automated logic, anticipating what would later become central to wartime code-breaking. These inventions were born not of abundance, but of constraint. Yet even as their success grew, so did the problem they could not solve. Germany adapted. Enigma gained new rotors. Procedures changed. The mathematical margin for error narrowed. Each improvement demanded more resources, more machines, more people, more time. Poland had none of these in surplus, and beyond the technical struggle loomed a harsher reality. By 1938, intelligence reports made it clear that war was no longer a question of if, but when. Poland would be struck first. Any laboratory they built would be seized. Any advantage they held would vanish overnight. This knowledge reshaped everything. The men who had broken Enigma were not planning how to win the war. They were planning how to make sure their work did not die with them. That is why the forest meeting mattered so deeply to them. It was not a presentation of success. It was an act of preservation. They were not asking for credit. They were asking for continuity. History often remembers victories as sudden revelations. But the truth is quieter. By the time anyone else believed Enigma could be broken, it already had been by men who understood that their role was not to be remembered, but to ensure that someone, somewhere, could continue the fight. When the meeting in the forest ended, there was no applause, no sense of triumph. The men packed their papers, dismantled the machines, and returned to a world that was already collapsing around them. What they had just done was unprecedented. For the first time, the inner logic of Enigma's wiring, its weaknesses, its assumptions had been transferred out of Poland. Not sold, not negotiated, simply given. Along with it went working replicas of the machine and the methods required to stay ahead of German changes. At least for a while, the British and French representatives left Pyre with something they had not expected. Proof that the impossible had already been done. Weeks later, war arrived exactly as Poland had feared. German forces crossed the border. Cities fell in days. Archives were destroyed. Intelligence units scattered. The mathematicians who had broken Enigma were forced to flee, carrying little more than fragments of their own work. Poland did not survive the invasion, but the knowledge did in Britain. That knowledge became the foundation upon which everything else was built at Bletchley Park. Analysts no longer started from ignorance. They began from a working understanding of Enigma's structure and advantage, measured not in comfort, but in time. Months, possibly years, were saved. Time that would decide battles before they were ever fought. As the war expanded, so did the consequences. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, cutting supply lines and starving Britain. Every convoy lost pushed the country closer to collapse. But encrypted naval traffic, once opaque, began to yield patterns. Routes were anticipated. Traps were avoided. Ships arrived that otherwise would not have. On land, German movements lost their invisibility. Plans that relied on secrecy became liabilities. The very confidence Enigma was meant to provide turned against its creators. This was not a single moment of victory. It was a slow erosion, day after day. Message by message, the advantage accumulated. Battles were shortened. Ambushes failed. Entire campaigns bent under pressure no one on the German side could see. And yet, none of this bore the names of the men who had made it possible. The war did not pivot because Enigma was cracked once. It pivoted because it remained crackable. Because when the machine changed, there was already a way of thinking prepared to follow it. That intellectual inheritance passed in silence before the first shots were fired, proved more durable than any weapon by the time the Allies understood the full value of ultra-intelligence. Poland was already under occupation. Its contribution had vanished behind the larger narrative of victory. History would later celebrate the place where Enigma was industrialized. It would rarely mention the place where it was first broken. The war moved on. The secret held, and the men who had made it possible slipped further into the background, as if their role had ended the moment they chose to give it away. When the war ended, the silence did not lift. It hardened. For years, even decades, the story of Enigma was locked behind classified files and careful omissions. The intelligence advantage it provided had been so decisive that revealing its origins was considered dangerous. The fewer people who knew how it began, the safer the secret remained. And so, when the public narrative of victory was finally written, it was incomplete by design. But secrecy alone does not explain the erasure. Poland had not emerged from the war as a victor with a voice. Its government in exile held little influence. Its territory fell behind a new political curtain. In the post-war world, history flowed outward from power. And Poland no longer had the authority to insist on its own version of events. There was also a quieter prejudice at work. The idea that a small, soon-to-be-defeated nation could outthink one of Europe's most technologically advanced militaries did not fit comfortably into the dominant story of the war. Credit gravitated toward places that survived intact, toward institutions that endured, expanded, and could speak for themselves. And then there was the nature of the work itself. Code-breaking does not leave ruins. It does not produce iconic photographs or decisive surrender ceremonies. Its victories are invisible by necessity. Success is measured in what does not happen: ships not sunk, attacks not launched, plans quietly abandoned. When secrecy finally fades, there is often nothing dramatic left to point to. Even within the Allied story, the emphasis settled on scale rather than origin. Large facilities, thousands of staff. Machines humming day and night, these images were easier to remember than a handful of mathematicians working under the assumption that their country would soon fall. The result was a historical compression. What began as a fragile breakthrough in Warsaw became remembered as a triumph of British ingenuity alone. The groundwork was absorbed into the structure that followed it, and the names attached to the beginning were slowly detached from the outcome by the time records were declassified, and scholars began reconstructing the full chain of events. The story had already solidified in public memory. Correcting it meant unsettling a narrative people thought they understood, so the polished contribution was acknowledged quietly, in footnotes. In academic circles, long after the men themselves were gone, history did not deny what they had done. It simply moved on without them. Today, the forest at Pyrie is unremarkable. No crowds gather there. No grand monument marks what changed in that quiet place. Trees have grown taller. Paths have faded. To an unknowing passerby, it is just another patch of woodland on the edge of a city rebuilt after devastation. And yet, the world we inhabit still carries the consequences of what happened there. Modern intelligence, cryptography, and even computing trace part of their lineage to a decision made by men who understood that knowledge has value only if it survives its creators. The idea that abstract thought, pure mathematics, could decide the outcome of industrial war reshaped how nations would fight conflicts for the rest of the century. But the deeper legacy is not technical, it is moral. The Polish mathematicians did not act because victory was assured. They acted because responsibility did not disappear simply because defeat was likely. They chose continuity over ownership, impact over recognition. In doing so, they accepted that history might never speak their names aloud, and for a long time, it did single quotes. We often imagine history turning on thunderous moments, declarations, invasions, triumphs broadcast to the world. But some of its most decisive shifts happen quietly, carried by people who understand that being right at the wrong time can be as dangerous as being wrong altogether. The war would eventually be won. Flags would be raised. Heroes would be celebrated. But none of that would erase the fact that before the first shots were fired, a handful of men from a country about to vanish chose to trust others with a secret that could save millions. So when we return, in our minds, to that forest in the summer of 1939, we are not witnessing a prelude to victory. We are witnessing an act of faith. Faith that truth, once shared, could outlive borders. Faith that even if history forgot them, their decision would still matter. And it did, because sometimes the people who change the course of history are not the ones who survive to tell it, but the ones who make sure it can still be told at all.